The car smelled of old fabric and winter breath. Its heater coughed more than it warmed, and the windows filmed over each night with a lace of frost. She learned to wipe a small oval clear with her sleeve so her child could look out in the morning and pretend they were just early for a trip, not waking up where they had fallen asleep. Some nights it was a church parking lot, the kind with a single light humming like an insect. Other nights it was a roadside rest area where the asphalt held the day's heat a little longer and the wind sounded like water moving over stones. She was 38, though hardship had rearranged the years on her face. Her hands had the quiet competence of someone who had once kept schedules and paid bills on time. She knew how to make breakfast out of crackers and a banana, how to brush hair with bottled water, how to smile at strangers without inviting questions. The child learned these things too, learning them as normal. They moved often, not because they wanted to, but because stillness invited notice. Churches were kind until they weren't. Rest areas were safe until the wrong car slowed. She kept a mental map of bathrooms that didn't require keys and water fountains that worked. She learned the language of nods and half-smiles that said, "We won't stay long." Once, her life had been small but solid. A rented apartment with a kitchen that caught the afternoon sun. A job that didn't make her rich but paid the electric bill without drama. Evenings where she read library books and planned nothing bigger than a weekend picnic. She had dreamed in modest shapes, steady work, a school that knew her child's name, a couch that fit the room. Dreams that don't attract envy, only the quiet satisfaction of being enough. The unraveling didn't come with a crash. It came with invoices. A medical emergency that stole a month of wages, then two. Insurance letters thick with words that seemed designed to confuse. A partner who said he needed space and then never returned, his absence leaving a hollow louder than any argument. The landlord was patient until he wasn't. Eviction notices are polite until the final one. She packed with care, as if careful packing could persuade the world to pause. She told herself it was temporary. That word did a lot of work. Temporary kept her upright in lines and gentle with her child. Temporary let her answer questions with confidence she didn't feel. Temporary made the nights bearable. The cold morning the letter found her, the sky was a pale, rinsed blue. She had parked near a shelter that offered coffee and a place to warm hands. Inside, the smell of paper and soap pressed against her senses. The woman at the desk knew her face well enough to smile without asking questions. "Something came for you," she said, and slid an envelope across the counter. The envelope was plain. No return address, she recognized. Her name was spelled correctly, which felt like a small miracle. She turned it over once, twice, then tucked it into her coat pocket while she poured coffee into a chipped mug. She had learned not to open hope in public places. Back in the car, she waited until her child was busy tracing shapes on the fogged glass. Then she opened the envelope with careful fingers. The letter inside was formal, printed on paper heavier than it needed to be. It spoke of records and estates and a relative whose name sat at the edge of her memory like a shadow. A great-uncle, perhaps. Someone who had once sent a birthday card with a crisp bill folded inside, years ago, before time erased the connection. The words that mattered were few: an abandoned farm, long unoccupied. No valuation, no warmth, just a location and an instruction to respond. She laughed, a sound that surprised her. It came out brittle. An abandoned farm. It sounded like the beginning of a story people told to make fun of hope. She imagined a sagging house with no roof, fields choked with weeds, a place that required money she didn't have just to stand still. She imagined being laughed out of an office when she asked for directions. Her first instinct was to tear the letter into careful strips and let them fall into the trash. She had learned what came after believing too much. Belief was expensive. She folded the paper instead, smoothing the crease, and slid it back into the envelope. The day went on. She counted coins for lunch and found a way to make them enough. Her child asked if they could go somewhere warm tonight. "We'll see," she said, and meant "I'll try." The letter stayed heavy in her pocket, a presence she pretended not to feel. By afternoon, the wind had sharpened. She drove without a destination, letting the car decide when it needed rest. At a red light, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes steady, mouth set. She thought of the farm as a place that would demand things from her she could not give. She thought of it as a mistake. But mistakes still have addresses. She parked near the edge of town where the road widened and the traffic thinned. She took the letter out again and read it as if reading could change its nature. The words did not soften, but they did not harden either. They waited. She thought of the maps she kept in her head, the places she had memorized for survival. She thought of the child asleep in the back seat, chin tucked into a jacket too big. She thought of how nowhere else had room for them that night, or the next. It wasn't hope that made her decision. Hope felt too extravagant. It was arithmetic, gas in the tank, a direction on a page, a promise that was thin but tangible. An abandoned farm could be a roof, even a bad one. It could be a place where no one knocked. She turned the key and felt the engine catch. The road accepted the car and carried it forward. The letter lay on the seat between them, no longer a joke, not yet a miracle. Just a piece of paper with a place on it, and a woman with nothing left to lose but the dignity she guarded like a flame. As the sun dipped and the cold followed, she drove toward the unknown, not because she believed it would save her, but because standing still had already taken everything it could. The road thinned to gravel miles before the address matched the sign. Pines leaned in as if to listen, their branches knitting the light into a dim, green hush. When the car finally rattled to a stop, the silence settled around it with a weight she felt in her chest. No birdsong, no distant engines, just the wind moving through tall grass and the long breath of a place that had been waiting. The farm lay ahead like a thought left unfinished. Fields stretched out, overgrown and uneven, the earth swelling and dipping as if the land itself had grown tired of being shaped. The barn leaned to one side, its red paint faded to a dry, cracked rust, boards loosening their grip on one another. Fence posts slumped, wires sagging into the weeds. Time had not erased the place. It had simply let it soften into itself. She cut the engine and listened. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. At the edge of the property stood a mailbox with its door hanging open. Inside, nothing. No flyers, no warnings. The house rose behind it, a narrow two-story with a porch that listed forward, steps worn into shallow bowls. Curtains hung inside, yellowed and still. She wondered who had closed them last and why. She had stopped for gas an hour earlier, a single pump under a flickering canopy. The man behind the counter had looked at the address on her paper and then at her face, as if measuring how much truth she could carry. "That place never brings good luck," he'd said, not unkindly. A woman sweeping the floor nodded without looking up. Another voice from the back added, "Nobody stays." She had thanked them and left, the words following her down the road like a low cloud. Now, with her child holding her hand, she climbed the porch steps slowly, testing each one. The door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood, a scent that clung to clothes and memory. The floorboards were sound in places and soft in others. She learned quickly where to step. The kitchen was small and spare. A table stood with one leg shimmed by folded paper. A cabinet door hung open, revealing chipped plates stacked with care. The sink ran when she turned the tap, the water browned for a moment before clearing. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Upstairs, 2 rooms waited, their windows cloudy but intact. She chose the one farthest from the stairs for the child, because it felt safer to her, though she couldn't say why. She laid their blankets on the floor and called it a bed. Shelter had become a word she understood in degrees. As the light shifted, she explored the barn. Inside, the space opened wide, beams arcing overhead like ribs. Dust motes hung in the air, catching the sun. Tools lay where hands had last set them down. Hooks, spades, a broken harness. In a corner, a ledger sat on a crate, its cover warped. She opened it carefully. Names and dates marched across the pages in a steady hand. Tallies of feed, notes about repairs, notations that seemed to repeat, symbols pressed into the margins, shapes she didn't recognize but felt oddly intentional. On the beams above, carved into the wood, the same symbols appeared, circles intersected by lines, marks that felt older than the nails that held the place together. She ran her fingers over them and felt a faint thrill, not fear, but recognition, as if the place was answering a question she hadn't asked. Outside, the land shifted as the sun dropped. Shadows lengthened. The wind moved through the fields and made a sound like breath. She had the sensation of being observed, not by eyes, but by the land itself, as if it were taking her measure. The feeling was not hostile. It was patient. She heard the horse before she saw it. A low, almost apologetic sound. She followed it to the far fence line where weeds swallowed the posts. There, tied to a broken rail with a rope worn thin as string, stood an old horse. Its ribs showed through a coat dulled to the color of dust. Its mane hung in tangles, gray threaded through brown. One hoof was wrapped in cloth, old and frayed. The horse lifted its head when she approached. Its eyes were dark and steady. It did not pull back or shy. It stood as if it had always been standing there, waiting. She felt a pull in her chest that surprised her. She had no feed, no brush, nothing to offer. She spoke anyway, her voice soft. The horse's ears flicked forward. It took a step closer, stopping just short of the rope's end. Later, when she returned to town for supplies she barely could afford, the warnings sharpened. That horse, someone said, snorting. Worthless. Too old to work, too weak to sell. Another added, should have been put down years ago. Nobody wanted it. Why is it still there? She asked, and the room went quiet for a moment. Habit, someone said finally. Or stubbornness. Back at the farm, she brought water in a bucket and held it steady while the horse drank. It drank slowly, deliberately, as if aware of the cost. When she finished, she rested her forehead against its neck. The warmth surprised her. The steadiness did too. That night, the wind rose and the house creaked. She lay awake listening, learning the language of the place. The silence wrapped around her, not suffocating, but complete. She thought of the symbols in the barn, the ledgers, the horse tied to a fence no one bothered to fix. Why had the horse been left? Why had the farm been allowed to fold in on itself, but not vanish? In the morning, she would begin the work of making the place livable. For now, she slept with the knowledge that she was not alone, that something here had noticed her arrival and, for reasons she could not yet name, had chosen not to turn away. She learned quickly what hunger looks like when it is not loud. The horse did not whinny or stamp. It stood and waited, its breath measured, its eyes attentive. She rationed what little she had. Oats bought with coins counted twice, apples bruised but sweet enough, water hauled in buckets that numbed her hands. She cleaned the old wrap from the hoof and replaced it with strips torn from a blanket she could spare. Each small act felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Days fell into a pattern shaped by care. The child helped, solemn and careful, brushing the horse's coat with a tool missing half its bristles. The horse tolerated the attention, leaning slightly, as if the contact steadied it. Slowly, the sharp angles softened. The coat began to shine in patches. When the horse shifted its weight, it did so with a little less apology. It was under the house that the story began to speak. She had been fixing a loose board in the kitchen when the plank lifted too easily. Beneath it, dust lay undisturbed, and under that, a thin notebook wrapped in oilcloth. She pried up another board and found more, journals stacked like a secret staircase descending into the past. She sat on the floor and read until the light thinned. The man who wrote them was careful with words. Dates were precise. Weather was noted. He spoke little of people. He wrote instead of soil and water, of repairs done quietly, of the virtue of leaving things as they were. Wealth appeared only as something to be avoided. Preservation is a form of love, he wrote once. The ink pressed hard as if the idea required force. And then, repeated across years, a phrase appeared in the margins. The horse knows where it sleeps. At first she thought it metaphor. Then she noticed the pattern. Each time the phrase appeared, the entries shifted away from chores and toward watchfulness. Notes about strangers on the road. About lights seen at night. About patience. The horse changed too. It began to move with intention. One morning, when she went to fetch water, it refused to follow its usual path. It stopped at the edge of the barn and pawed the earth, once, twice, then stood still. She laughed, thinking it stubbornness, and tugged gently. The horse did not resist, it simply would not go. She fetched a shovel. The soil there was packed hard, stones biting the blade. She dug until her arms shook, until sweat cut clean lines through the dust on her skin. She found nothing but earth and old roots. Embarrassed, she filled the hole and led the horse away. The next day, the horse led her elsewhere. It paused by the barn's far corner, where the foundation met the ground in a shadowed seam. It pawed again, slower this time, and looked at her. The feeling returned, the sense of being observed, expectant. She knelt and brushed dirt aside with her hands. Her fingers caught on wood where stone should have been. A panel, sealed and disguised, fitted into the foundation like a thought hidden in plain sight. She pried it loose. Inside were oil-wrapped bundles and metal cases, their edges dulled by time. Papers crackled as she lifted them into the light. Deeds, maps, patents stamped with dates that made her breath catch. Mineral rights claimed and renewed, then forgotten by everyone but the land. Ownership trails that led nowhere because they had been designed to disappear. She spread the documents across a crate, her mind racing. This was not the inheritance of a broken house and a tired field. This was a story written to be overlooked. The journals made sense now. The reclusive man had not been hoarding. He had been keeping. He wrote of people who wanted to buy, to dig, to take. He wrote of refusing them without drama. He wrote of the horse, how it had been trained not to pull, not to race, but to stand and remember. Guarding is not movement, one entry read. It is presence. She closed the journal and rested her hand on the horse's neck. The horse breathed, slow and steady, as if it had been holding that breath for years. They found more compartments over the next week. Each discovery followed the same pattern. The horse would lead, stop, paw, and wait. Under a feed trough. Beneath a plank near the well. Behind a false wall where the barn's shadow fell thickest. Each time, the contents deepened the mystery. Correspondence from lawyers long dead. Notices returned unopened. Proofs of claims that had outlived the people who tried to bury them. Suspicion grew like a quiet fire. This farm had never been abandoned. It had been hidden, not to protect wealth for its own sake, but to protect something fragile from a world that took without listening. At night, she lay awake and imagined the man riding by lamplight, choosing patience over profit. She imagined the horse standing in the dark, hearing things people missed. She wondered what it meant to be trusted by a place. The child sensed the change. The horse likes us? Came the soft observation one evening, offered as fact. She smiled and nodded, though the truth felt larger than liking. One afternoon, as clouds gathered and the air thickened, a car slowed on the road and then moved on. The horse lifted its head, ears pricked, body angled just so. She felt a flicker of fear, then steadiness. Whatever had been hidden here had been waiting for someone who would stay. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet. Trust, she had learned, was earned by listening before speaking. When the rain came, it washed the dust from the fields and darkened the beams. Water ran clean. The horse stood in the open and let it fall, eyes half closed, a sentinel at rest but not relieved. She understood then that guardianship could be quiet and still powerful. That memory could live in muscle and habit. That sometimes survival depended on remembering where something slept and choosing to stand watch until the right hands arrived. The farm held its breath. The horse remembered, and in the space between them, a woman learned to trust what could not be hurried. The first lawyer she spoke to did not look up from the papers for a long time. The office smelled faintly of toner and old books, a place where facts were weighed and found either sufficient or wanting. She sat straight-backed in a borrowed chair, her hands folded to keep them from trembling. When he finally looked at her, his expression had shifted into something like awe. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this isn't a small claim." She nodded, though she did not yet understand the shape of it. The confirmations came slowly at first, then all at once. Surveyors walked the land with instruments that beeped and chirped, tracing lines drawn a century ago and never erased. Geologists studied samples taken from places the horse had led her to, their voices lowering as they spoke of rarity and depth. Titles were cross-referenced. Patents resurfaced. Claims dismissed long ago because no one could find their anchor suddenly had won. Beneath the farm lay resources bound by century-old rights, preserved by intent and time. The valuation arrived in a sealed envelope, printed in a font that tried to look neutral. The number did not. $115 million. It sat on the page like a mistake until it didn't. She went home and stood in the yard with the paper in her hand. The fields did not change. The barn did not lean less. The horse chewed hay and watched her with its steady eyes. The number meant nothing here, she realized. Not yet. The calls began the next day. They came with friendly voices and polished phrases. Representatives who spoke of opportunity and partnership, who assured her they could make things easy. The offers were generous in tone and small in fact. Settlements that would clear her debts and leave her with enough to feel grateful. When she asked for time, the warmth cooled. Then the letters arrived. Thick envelopes stamped with urgency. Words sharpened into warnings. Claims that her documents were incomplete, her ownership questionable. Suggestions that fighting would be expensive, draining, and ultimately futile. She learned a new vocabulary: injunctions, countersuits, delays. She learned how quickly hope could be reframed as naivety. In the evenings, she sat at the kitchen table and read the old journals again. The man's handwriting felt closer now, the lines pressed with intention. They will come with money, one entry read. They will tell you it is safer to sell. Safety is not the same as right. The horse figured into everything in ways she hadn't expected. The records were meticulous, feed purchases logged, veterinary notes kept, training described not as labor, but as duty. Photographs, brittle with age, showed the same horse at different stages, always in the same places, always near the same marks on the land. The continuity mattered. It established presence. Guardianship not as ownership, but as stewardship carried forward without interruption. When the first formal challenge landed, she felt the old fear rise, swift and familiar. The memory of eviction notices pressed against her ribs. The thought of losing again, of being told she did not belong, threatened to pull her under. One night, after the child slept, she walked the property alone. The wind moved through the fields. The barn creaked. She rested her hand on the fence where the horse always stood and closed her eyes. The quiet felt heavier than before, as if the land itself were listening. She thought of the offers on the table, the certainty of a check, the relief of finality. She thought of the cost of standing firm, time, money she did not have, the risk of public scrutiny. She thought of how easily the world took from people like her, and how rarely it apologized. In the barn, beneath the place where the horse preferred to rest when the sun was high, she noticed a loose stone she had somehow missed. It shifted under her fingers. Behind it, a narrow cavity opened, lined with tin. Inside lay a single envelope, sealed with wax so old it crumbled at her touch. The document within was brief. It named no sum. It spoke instead of intention. The original owner had written it as a safeguard, to be revealed only if the rest failed. It confirmed the transfer in plain language, binding the land and its rights to the inheritor by name and by proof of care. Not possession, care. She sat on the barn floor and laughed, a sound that broke and then steadied. The horse lowered its head and breathed, warm and solid. The hearing was held in a room that echoed. She wore her best coat and carried a folder thick with papers that told a story longer than anyone in the room. The corporations came with teams. She came with facts and a steadiness she did not know she possessed. The judge listened. Questions were asked. Documents were compared. The continuity of guardianship, the horse's unbroken presence, the records that proved it, became the thread no one could cut. The final document, produced at last, settled the matter with a simplicity that felt almost unfair. Ownership confirmed. Claims dismissed. Outside, the air felt different. She stood on the steps and let the noise of the city wash over her, then fade. The number followed her like a shadow, unreal and heavy. She did not feel triumphant. She felt released. Back at the farm, the silence changed. It was no longer waiting. It exhaled. The wind moved differently. The fields seemed to lift their heads. She fed the horse and leaned against the fence, watching the light fall across the land. The fear did not vanish. It softened. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear but the decision to stand anyway. The value no one saw coming was not just beneath the ground. It was in the choice to protect what could be taken, to trust the quiet work of guardianship, and to believe, against habit, that some inheritances were designed to find the right hands, even if it took a lifetime of waiting. The farm was no longer hidden, and for the first time, neither was she. The contracts were signed in a room filled with light. Pens moved. Hands were shaken. The language was precise and binding, and when it was finished, the fortune was no longer a rumor or a threat. It was hers, secured, undeniable. And still, when the offers returned, larger now, louder, she said no. Not to all of it, but to the part that mattered most. She sold only what could be spared. She refused the clean erasure, the kind that flattened history into profit and called it progress. The land stayed whole. The claims beneath it were managed with limits written as carefully as promises. Preservation was not a sentiment, it was a policy. Restoration began slowly, as if the farm needed to be convinced. Roofs were mended without changing their pitch. Walls were strengthened but not straightened into unfamiliar lines. The barn's beams were cleaned and sealed, the carved symbols left untouched. Paths were cleared where the grass had once hidden them, and the fields were coaxed back into use with patience rather than force. The house warmed. Windows were opened. The silence learned a new shape. She remembered the nights in the car, the way stillness had meant danger. She remembered the shelter's coffee, the kindness that asked for nothing in return. Those memories guided her choices. Along the edge of the property, small homes rose, modest, sturdy, built to last without boasting. They were offered to families who arrived with the same quiet fear she once carried. People who needed time more than charity. Rent was fair. Rules were simple. Dignity was assumed. She did not put her name on a sign. The horse watched the changes with the same steady calm it had always shown. Its work was done, though it did not know that in words. Its days settled into a rhythm of sun and shade, of gentle hands and unhurried walks. The limp eased. The ribs disappeared beneath a coat grown thick and glossy. When it lay down in the field for the first time, fully, without tension, she sat nearby and cried, surprised by the depth of her gratitude. Guardianship had been a long vigil. Rest was its own kind of reward. Her child grew into the place, learning its contours as naturally as breath. They learned where the light fell in the morning and how to listen for rain. One afternoon, sitting on the porch steps, the child asked if they were rich. She considered the question carefully. "We have enough," she said, "and we have each other." Later, when the child was older, she explained it more fully. She spoke of choices and patience, of how money could open doors but not decide who you were once inside. She told the story of the horse, not as a miracle, but as a lesson in staying. "What saved us," she said, "wasn't the number. It was the way we kept going when there wasn't one." The farm filled with life. Laughter carried across the fields. Tools rang against wood. Gardens grew where weeds had once claimed the ground. Yet some things remained unchanged. The barn's quiet corners were left alone. The symbols stayed. Certain paths were not widened. The land had protected something for a long time. Respect required listening. On a clear evening, she walked the perimeter with the horse at her side. The fence was mended now, strong and clean, but she still rested her hand on it out of habit. The horse stopped where it always had and breathed. She breathed with it. The silence was no longer heavy. It was spacious. She thought of the man who had written by lamplight, who had chosen patience over profit. She hoped he would recognize the shape of what remained. Preservation is a form of love. She had learned that by living it. When the horse's time came, it was gentle. The field was warm. The sky was wide. She stayed until the last breath left its body, and then she stayed longer. They buried it beneath the old tree where it had liked to stand, a marker simple and true. The land held the memory without ceremony. Years later, visitors would come and remark on the feeling of the place. They would say it felt cared for. They would not know why. The farm was no longer silent, but it was still respectful. It kept what it had been asked to keep. And in return, it offered shelter, not just from weather, but from the idea that worth had to be proven loudly. Some treasures aren't meant to be taken, only understood. If this story moved you, reminded you of resilience, or made you believe that quiet kindness still matters, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where hope survives against all odds. Sometimes, the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but in the choices we make when no one is watching.